This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
To go on with business as usual, as if we are not facing an assault on truth itself, is to set up the lawn chairs on the deck of the Titanic.
TikTok and YouTube and Instagram. That's teenage news.
The true communist or the true Nazi was not the person that joined the party and got the uniform and got all of the accoutrements of being a member of one of those groups. The most pliable Nazi and the most pliable communist was the person who said, gosh, I really don't know what to believe.
Now Meta is like, we serve 2 billion people, like a third of the world's population, but we don't have to be beholden to facts because we're just a conduit or something. I think that level of that abdication of social responsibility is alarming. Alarming is what I would say.
Welcome to The Big Threat, a podcast about the global information wars and how mis and disinformation are eroding the democracies we live in. I'm Bryce Corbett. In this podcast series that's been made possible by the Winston Churchill Trust, join me on a trip around the world to meet the experts taking up the fight against fake news in what has become a race against time. Journalists, academics, government officials and educators all working their corners of the globe to foster the critical thinking skills that will enable their populations to separate online fact from fiction, one of the defining challenges of the digital age. This is The Big Threat. Growing up in the 1980s, I lived in what you'd probably describe as an average household when it came to news consumption. We weren't an especially newsy family, but there was always a newspaper lying around the house or a radio on, meaning we absorbed news almost by osmosis. And even though our sources of information were strictly limited in number and variety, we were able to take for granted the information we were taking in had been vetted and checked before it got to us, to lesser and greater degrees, by organisations whose business model and indeed very existence relied on them being both accurate and trustworthy. Fast forward 40 years, and all of that has changed. I'm now a journalist of some 25 years' experience who cut his teeth at a tabloid newspaper and has since worked in print, TV and radio, both in Australia and overseas. I'm also, not insignificantly, a dad of 2 teenagers whose media consumption habits could not be more different from my own at their age. They rarely watch free-to-air television, a radio is something only their grandparents use, and while I leave newspapers lying around the living room, they go unnoticed and untouched, like some ancient artefact from a bygone era. Moreover, what news and information they do consume comes almost exclusively from TikTok or YouTube, or any number of mysterious social media apps that they're on that I don't even know about. Which, as an old journo, gave me pause for thought a couple of years ago and prompted me to create Squiz Kids, a daily news podcast for kids, to provide a source of news for kids that was engaging and entertaining.
Squiz Kids! It's your daily news fix. Fun, free, fresh.
A daily offering that started to sensitise them to the idea that whilst there was information out there they could trust, there was also a lot of stuff out there that they couldn't. When my kids started coming to the dinner table, telling my wife and I about facts, in inverted commas, that they'd picked up while scrolling through social media, I set to work with some clever school teacher colleagues to create Newshounds, a digital literacy classroom resource teaching kids how to tell online fact from fiction.
We are the Newshounds. We sniff out the truth of every news story. We scratch...
And that, in an admittedly very long-winded way, is an explanation of the what and the why of this podcast. Through my work with Newshounds, I was awarded a Churchill Fellowship to travel the world and meet with other media and digital literacy practitioners. People as far afield as San Francisco, New York, London, Paris, Tallinn and Helsinki. People who are as convinced as I am that disinformation is currently one of the greatest, most underestimated threats to the very democracies, political systems, and world order that we have come to take for granted. Now, I know that sounds overblown, and as a journo, I'm generally allergic to hyperbole. But when it comes to fighting mis and disinformation, I honestly believe that there's nothing more important than the future of Western democracy at stake. Over the course of this podcast series, you'll meet, as I did, some of the brightest minds in the media literacy world, sounding the alarm on this looming crisis. You'll join me as I visit countries that are on self-described disinformation war footing, and learn how in some nations, digital literacy is more than a nice to have, it's existential. My first stop, San Francisco. I've gone from the sticky humidity of a Brisbane summer to the decidedly cooler climb of a Northern California winter, and it's definitely bracing. Why have I come to San Francisco as the first stop on my Churchill Fellowship? Because I'm keen to find out more about the legislation recently passed in California, making media literacy education mandatory in all state schools. And there's no better person to ask than Professor Sam Wineburg from Stanford University. He is one of the world's authorities on media literacy, and specifically the importance of incorporating it into our education systems. His book, called Verified: How to Think Straight, Get Duped Less and Make Better Decisions About What to Believe Online, is one of the defining texts on the topic of digital literacy.
Back in the days of print, there were many indications for allowing us to understand the different genres that journalism used. So, for instance, on the front page, it was generally news, and if there was an advertisement, it was set off in a box, and there it was very clearly marked as an advertisement. So there were tactile indications of what was news, what was opinion, and what was an ad. All of those bets are off on the unregulated internet. It's very difficult to tell whether something's an ad. It's difficult to tell whether something is a news story or straight opinion. All of those indications are now off the table. So it's the job of making those kinds of decisions has become infinitely more complex.
And you're an education expert, and would you say that our education system has kept pace with that evolution?
That would be the most ludicrous statement that I could possibly say. School remains largely an analog institution where texts are vetted before they're put into the hands of students, which is an important principle in and of itself. But think about all of the levels of oversight that a textbook or a workbook has to go through before it reaches a student. The internet is unregulated. So how is it that students are ever supposed to learn how to make judgments about what to believe and what not to believe if they are bubble children raised in a protective school environment that never exposes them to the kinds of things that they see immediately when they're scrolling on their phone for 7 to 8 hours outside of school?
Absolutely. The point you also make in your book is that during that period when media sources were limited, the people providing that information reputationally, to greater or lesser degrees, took it upon themselves to ensure that the information they presented was going to be correct. But that has now gone out the window in this new world information order, has it not?
Absolutely. Well, think about just how the platform X monetizes contributors. Contributors are monetized by their level of engagement. So the more incendiary, the more enraged, the richer the rage merchant becomes. And that is a term, rage merchants, people who profit off of the skillful deploying of anger, of trolling, of rage, because that seems to be a recipe for more engagement, which ultimately leads to a greater pay stub from the platforms that provide it. In other words, it pays to lie.
It also pays to know your customer. And in the case of big tech, and especially the companies involved in search, it pays to know them better than even they know themselves.
Search engines are not truth engines. Search engines are looking for the slightest indication of what we want. And so because the economic model is one of engagement and attention, because the longer we stay on the screen, the greater the opportunity that the platform has to sell us ads or to provide us with ads. The classic statement in Silicon Valley is, if it's free, the product is you. And so many people don't understand. They say, oh, I can use Instagram. It's free. There's not. Yes, well, the platforms are collecting an inordinate amount of information about each one of our buying habits, our proclivities, etc.
Because this is the point, isn't it? I mean, it's not as if the browser is taking its cues from the first character you type into a search. It's already built up an inordinate amount of information about who you are and what your interests and prejudices might be. And it's therefore serving up what it knows you want.
Even in the case of going incognito, even in the case of never using a browser and using it for the first time, those tells will also provide the browser with information about what it thinks you want. It's the notion of inferred intent. The browser is inferring your intent from your keywords and trying to give you what you want.
Because it wants to keep you on for as long as possible.
It wants to keep you on. It's built to maximize engagement.
If you think about it, we spend a lot of time teaching kids the road safety rules before we let them out onto the street. Here in Australia, we spend a lot of time making sure kids have swimming lessons because we're an island and we're surrounded by water and beaches. And yet it seems to be with the internet, we're prepared to let them free on the internet without giving them any lessons in how to deal with what they come across when they're on there.
Even worse, we tend to impute to young people an expertise because we see them operating digital devices with a seeming fluency. And if we have a difficult time uploading a photo to a photo sharing site or getting the latest version of Microsoft Word, we turn to the adolescents in our household and say, please help us. And the problem with that is that we make a jump that only on its surface seems logical. And that jump is because someone is able to operate a technological device, they also possess the cognitive armamentarium for making judgments about the information that that device produces. And so the ability to use a device and the ability to understand how it works are two very different things. And unfortunately, many adults make an inferential error when they associate the ability to use the device with the ability to make judgments about the information that device provides us.
At least some of that logic may have been at play at the end of 2024 when the Australian government passed legislation to ban kids under 16 from social media. This was Australia's Prime Minister at the time.
World-leading action to make sure social media companies meet their social responsibility. Social media is doing harm to our children. And today, as a direct result of our legislation passed through the Parliament yesterday, through the Senate and confirmed in the House today, parents can have a different discussion with their young ones.
But as world-leading and ambitious as the new law is, questions remain about its implementation.
Any type of ban like that is going to be circumvented. So that's the first thing that's going to be said. There'll be a few little things that will do it. But again, young people are incredibly resourceful, and they will find their way to all of the pornography on the web under the age of 16 and all of the other kinds of things. The problem that you have in Australia right now, and again, we shouldn't just focus on children, because I just read a report that actually my research group was able to consult with a group of researchers at the University of Canberra, Sora Park, which showed that in a survey of over 2,000 adults, Australian adults, 97% of them experienced some type of difficulty in verifying information. But here's the thing that was most concerning to me in that report. 39% of the adults who said they were confident at verifying information online, 39% said they were confident. Of that 39%, there was not a single respondent who got a single answer right on one of the 4 exercises that the researchers provided. So again, this is a very common problem. that we have tremendous confidence on our ability to do something that nobody has ever checked us on. So if I'm playing tennis, as I did this morning, and I flub a ball that comes to me from my opponent, I have immediate feedback that I've done something wrong. The feedback is instantaneous. But when I'm searching on the web and I get entrapped and go down a rabbit hole, and I think that I have found verified information, and I am actually in the clutches of a conspiracy theory, there's no one to tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, you've just been taken in.
In his role as the former Margaret Jacks Chair of Education at Stanford and co-principal of the Digital Inquiry Group, an organisation providing free, evidence-based educational resources to teachers all over the world, Professor Wineburg was instrumental in the creation of legislation in California mandating media literacy education in all public schools. And while the law has been slow to take effect, the bigger challenge, according to him, is ensuring media literacy is integrated in all subjects at school and not simply delivered as a one-off lesson.
So the implementation is slow. It just became officially into law at the beginning of January. And the mandate is quite broad. The integration of digital literacy, information literacy across the school subjects. To do that is a major budgetary commitment. And right now, we're waiting to see if that commitment comes through. Things will not change if we create a new subject for the curriculum called information literacy or digital curriculum and expect the whole school system to turn on a dime and to change something that has tremendous resistance to change, which is the curriculum. What we can do is to appeal to the goodwill of that biology teacher who sees students coming in with the craziest ideas about vaccines, or the history teacher who hears students come in with very strange and dangerous ideas about what actually happened in World War II. And we appeal to the goodwill of those teachers who recognize that to do their job, they need to also not just teach history and biology, they need to teach their students how these subjects play out in the areas of the curriculum that they're responsible for. That's how change is going to happen.
So a 2-hour media literacy workshop with the librarian once a year, it's not going to cut it.
Not when the average Australian or American adolescent spends 6 to 8 hours online each day. It is, to use a scientific term, it is pissing in the wind.
Of course, things are only complicated further when the spreading of misinformation is actively weaponized to suit a particular political outcome.
Right now, I say it's both scale, depth, and urgency. That's why you're seeing, and look, I strongly believe in the flood the zone theory, which has just overwhelmed the opposition. They've already started.
Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon made headlines during the first Trump administration, describing the tactic of purposefully confusing the electorate so that they either believe untruths or simply lose the will to seek out what's real.
One sociologist in particular, Jennifer Walters, she makes this really interesting point that she says this is a deliberate tactic used by regimes, used by powerful entities to manipulate and control people by bombarding them with so much information that they feel overwhelmed. It's called the shock and awe tactic. And so you've got this rapid influx of information or change, and it creates this sense of disorientation and fear that I think a lot of us are feeling, and it makes it difficult to critically analyze and then, of course, react appropriately.
And the political climate it creates leaves the likes of Professor Wineburg feeling, much like the electorate generally, more than slightly overwhelmed.
We are in a fundamentally different information environment, and we have seen not the writing on the wall, but the effect of it. And so I'm sure your listeners recall the cataclysmic events that happened on January 6th during the outgoing Trump administration. Is what happened an assault on American democracy or a celebration of American patriotism? This is the kind of confusion that is being cultivated and propagated in order to confuse and to muddle people's thinking. These people are criminals. They are not patriots. They violated the most sacred chambers of American democracy. So we are at a crisis point. And either as a society, we're going to recognize that if we forfeit the idea of truth, if we say, oh, the 2020 election between Trump and Biden, well, there's two sides to it. After it's already been adjudicated by over 80 court cases that show there was no vote tampering, it's clear that Joe Biden was the undisputed winner of that election. If we turn that into other sideism and let's look at both sides, then what we're engaging in is Steve Bannon's flooding the zone. We're engaging in Soviet-style misinformation. Make it so difficult that people throw their hands up and say, I don't know what to believe. And, I want to go back to Hannah Arendt. The true communist or the true Nazi was not the person that joined the party and got the uniform and got all of the accoutrements of being a member of one of those groups. The most pliable Nazi and the most pliable communist was the person who said, gosh, I really don't know what to believe. I'm confused. Let me put my faith in the Führer. Let me put my faith in the great leader Stalin. And the idea of trying to create that confusion on a mass level is what you will find in any country where a strong man takes over and tries to say, don't believe the press. It's all fake news. The thing to do is believe me, only me.
From where you're sitting, what do the next 4 years in the US look like with the re-election of President Trump?
Well, I think that the stakes are higher. I don't think it takes anyone of goodwill, whether they are a Democrat or a Republican, if they believe that this nation is a nation of laws and not of men, then to forfeit the pursuit of truth is the beginning of our undoing. And so, as an educator, I have to be optimistic. I have to believe that the impoverished state of our understanding is due not to some genetic abnormality, but is due to a kind of lassitude and a failure to see the writing on the wall by educators, that to go on with business as usual, as if we are not facing an assault on truth itself, is to set up the lawn chairs on the deck of the Titanic.
I've come to Fisherman's Wharf, the famous San Francisco tourist attraction, to process Professor Wineburg's words. And it's a bleak picture he's painting. In a USA Today op-ed that he wrote, the link to which is in the episode notes, Professor Wineburg calls for the same sort of comprehensive, international, multi-government effort that successfully delivered the Human Genome Project as the only way to effectively fight mis- and disinformation. Referring to the US, he says that it will require the same sort of national mobilization that put a man on the moon back in 1969 to make any sort of impact in the war against misinformation. Of course, some might say that that requires a government whose survival doesn't depend on, and I quote, flooding the zone with shit. The question is, are governments, or indeed populations, sufficiently motivated by the scale of the disinformation problem to yet effect the same sort of generational change? Or is it too late? Are we so enthralled to our screens, so addicted to the scroll, that we won't look up from our devices long enough to realise how comprehensively we've been misled? How deeply under the influence of misinformation we've all become? It's all a bit Orwellian. Next stop, the San Francisco-based public broadcaster KQED, to learn about the work they're doing with US school kids with something called the Youth Media Challenge. And I'm hoping that meeting people whose job it is to deal with teenagers day in, day out will perhaps inject a little bit of optimism into proceedings.
Meanwhile, a major announcement this morning from Meta. Meta, the parent company of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. In a video posted on his platforms today, CEO Mark Zuckerberg announcing big changes to the company's fact-checking policy. NBC's senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson joins us now with more on this. And Hallie, the timing is a bit curious, just days ahead of the start of a new administration.
Yeah, that's right, Craig. Good morning to you. And the big headline here, no more fact-checking, as we've noted for the last 8 years on Facebook. And
here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to get rid of fact-checkers and replace them with community notes, similar to X, starting in the US. After Trump first got elected in 2016, the legacy media wrote nonstop about how misinformation was a threat to democracy. We tried in good faith to address those concerns without becoming the arbiters of truth. But the fact-checkers have just been too politically biased and have destroyed more trust than they've created.
Tuesday, January 7 in San Francisco begins with a crisp, blue-skied winter's day, and the news that Meta, the parent company of Facebook, has decided to discontinue fact-checking on its platforms. For the past few years, they've been paying journalists and media organisations like Agence France-Presse to fact-check content posted to their social media platforms, in response to widespread government and community concerns that mis- and disinformation is being allowed to flourish there. But in a stunning about-face, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg has agreed to discontinue the practice, and instead of having professionals police the authenticity of information on Facebook, he announces he's going to leave it up to Facebook users themselves, just like fellow tech bro Elon Musk has done with X, the social media platform formerly known as Twitter. It's an announcement that has come only days after reports say Zuckerberg has been to visit President-elect Donald Trump at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. A fact that's being widely reported here in the United States as more than a simple coincidence. It makes my impending visit to San Francisco's public broadcaster KQED incredibly timely. KQED is the San Francisco Bay Area public broadcaster. It's an independent producer of radio, TV, and online news, funded by a combination of government money and local philanthropy. The KQED crew I'll be meeting are a group of educators creating resources for teachers to help teach media literacy to high school kids in the US.
So right now we're in the more administrative section, podcast science is over there.
I sit down with Randy Depew, who heads up the education unit and helps to run something called the Youth Media Challenge. It works on a kids learn best by doing principle, hoping that by getting kids to make news reports on subjects that matter to them, they'll start to understand that every piece of content they see in their daily scroll has been made by someone, and often with an agenda in mind.
So the Youth Media Challenge, our focus at KQED is the elevation of diverse youth voice, is the way we say it. And we think it's really important that young people are part of our large public conversations. That when we're talking about climate change, or we're talking about race, or we're talking about LGBTQ issues, we're talking about the things that really matter to us as a culture. And then we showcase that student voice on KQED's Youth Media Challenge website. We have about 4,000 submissions of youth voice at this point. And then we take those pieces and select pieces we work on sharing more broadly. So we get it on KQED's radio or television station. We share it through KQED's social media, and we take it from something that became a classroom project, and we potentially then can share this young person's voice with 500,000 people.
You're an educator. You have quite a bit to do with kids, obviously, through the Youth Media Challenge. What are you seeing in terms of media consumption amongst teens in the United States? Where are they getting their news and information?
TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube would be the three largest sources of information I know from my own children.
What would you say the levels of media literacy is amongst young Americans? How attuned do you think they are to the existence of mis and disinformation?
I think they absolutely know that misinformation is out there. I think the problem is that we've taught people to question, and we've told them that there's misinformation. So they know to question things. Yes, they don't believe the misinformation, but they also don't believe the truth. And so because we've taught them to not believe anything, and we've taught them that everything comes with an ulterior motive, and anything digitally is not necessarily to be trusted. And so therefore they don't trust anything. So are they media literate in the sense of being able to avoid misinformation? Yeah, but they might also be avoiding positive and helpful information in the same way, because they don't know if that's true either.
The decision, of course, by Meta to remove fact checkers from its platforms, how seismic would you say that is in terms of the levels of mis and disinformation to which users are now going to be exposed?
It's a travesty in a lot of ways that we can't in some ways hold platforms more accountable. But that's very much a United States thing, right? And that happened at the dawn of the internet, which was, if you're going to let us build this internet, then you need to make all of us not liable for the content that we're putting on there. And that's carried forth. And now Meta is like, we serve 2 billion people, like a third of the world's population, but we don't have to be beholden to facts because we're just a conduit or something. I think that level of that abdication of social responsibility is alarming. Alarming is what I would say.
And so that's the challenge, but how is it being met? Moreover, what confidence do people like Randy have that the Californian government's recent legislation to mandate media literacy education in all public schools is going to start to provide a solution?
The one danger is that oftentimes it's unfunded, right? We get a lot of unfunded mandates, like do this, but we're not giving you any money to do it. So what we're really seeing right now is teachers seeking out, right? They're getting the message. They know that media literacy is an issue, and they're seeking it out on their own, right? And the systematic is catching up to that. With the teachers we work with, it's really clear that they are owning that responsibility.
And yet, sometimes things can be a little more complicated on the front line of teaching, can't they, than perhaps legislators might think. And certainly in Australia, teachers often have to be perhaps more careful than ever before about what they're teaching and whether that's going to trigger complaints from parents. Is it the same here in the United States?
We have had since the election of President Trump, we are seeing the impact of who our president is on the way teachers are treated and perceived 100%. He has, in a lot of ways, given license to kind of these attacks on school policy, the attacks on reading lists, attacks on libraries, attacks on LGBTQ issues, attacks on our ability to teach critical race theory or to teach race at all, or to teach issues like vaccinations, like science, climate change. We just recently had a national climate change webinar that we put on, and a couple of our partners were really nervous about using the term climate change in the title, because they're like, well, we receive federal funding and he doesn't like this word. And so we're seeing definitely a impact. And so on the teacher level, when you're a teacher and you're like, I've got to build curriculum, whole topic areas where teachers have to be really brave to like venture into. I'd like to think we're all educators are brave frontline warriors who are putting in the battle. But the reality is we have families and we have, our own lives that we have to put together. And is it worth like becoming a target? And that's a really tough spot to be in. Most people who enter education enter it for all the right reasons, right? And then you're in a position where you are forced to toe the line of effectively an authoritarian regime. It definitely suffers mental health. I worry about what it does to the profession long term. People will leave, right? People will leave the profession before they willingly spout propaganda. And so then who does that leave behind? Is maybe just the propagandists. I don't know, man. It's dark days. It's dark days. We are living in the dystopian future that we read about in all of those books we were growing up, and now we're in it. And we're like, really? Like, is that really happening? And we're like, yeah, it really is. Crazy stuff.
Compounding the issue in the United States is the seeming determination of the new administration to defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a body that funnels billions in federal government funding to public broadcasters all over the country.
So the president would like to defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It is responsible for primarily the functioning of like these 300 stations across the country. Especially the most impacted will be the small rural stations that serve people, outside of large metropolitan areas, where the Corporation for Public Broadcasting might account for 70 or 80% of their operating budget.
Wow.
Here at KQED, it's not like that. We have a much more diverse funding base because we're in a major metropolitan area. But it is a concern for sure. And that attack on public media is in full swing in the United States for sure.
And while a federal government assault on public broadcasting in the United States is in full swing, the journalists working at KQED are protected, to a certain extent, by the large number of corporates who sponsor them, foundations that support them, and ordinary citizens from the Bay Area who value their work sufficiently to put their hands regularly into their pockets to keep KQED afloat. How many members would you have, individuals who are?
We have over 250,000 individual members who pay every year to be a KQED member.
Amazing. And that is just in the Bay Area of San Francisco?
That is for our station specifically. Yes, we have now some of our members are in far-flung places, but they are all paying specifically to be a member of KQED, yeah.
And is it, given the dystopian world in which we apparently appear to be stumbling, is it potentially good for business for organisations like yours? Will there be a rush to the sort of quality that perhaps you're offering up?
We definitely in the first Trump presidency saw an increase in membership in response to his election. And in this time, we're still trying to figure out what those messages are and what people really care about. So I don't want to speak too much about that and make a mistake, but I will say that, we have returned to number one. We are the number one radio station in the entire San Francisco Bay Area now.
Wow.
We're all news. That's a big part of that is response to, that people are coming to us for news about the administration and about the world that they feel they can trust.
So this is where the revolution begins, Randy.
Right here in my office.
As I set off on my Churchill Fellowship travels, it's clear that the Trump administration 2.0 is going to loom large in all discussions that I have here in the United States. This, of course, is the same president that coined, or at least made popular, the phrase fake news. The commander-in-chief under whose watch mis and disinformation were allowed to flourish, hand in hand with the presidential disdain or even contempt from the mainstream media. And in the months that follow, the president and his Republican Party will launch a full-throated assault on the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in the United States, and the two institutions it largely supports, NPR and PBS, threatening to defund them whilst accusing them of reporting with political bias. After my first meeting with the folk at KQED, it's clear they're looking forward to the next 4 years with no small amount of trepidation. On the flip side, maybe it's good for business. The more that mis and disinformation are left to flourish unchallenged, the more right-thinking people may be motivated to do something about it. That's the hope, at least. Certainly, the fact that more than 250,000 wealthy and ordinary Americans regularly donate to KQED to keep its wheels turning speaks to that theme. The other surprising thing, coming into California, I'd been led to believe from media reports that recent state government legislation mandating media literacy education in all public schools had made the state a market leader when it came to protecting the next generation from information manipulation. Clearly, though, it's a little more complicated. As both Professor Wineburg and KQED's Randy Depew told me, Implementation is patchy, and a lack of meaningful government funding to back it up means it's only having an impact where brave, progressive teachers, who are unafraid to make themselves targets in an environment where conservative forces are otherwise cowing them, dare to take it on. Join me next episode as I head to Washington, D.C. in the grip of a presidential inauguration, and then on to New York City, where I visit a classroom to see media literacy instruction in action and meet some of America's frontline soldiers leading the fight against mis and disinformation.
Trump's ratings in the opinion polls suggest there could be a rebalancing, notably at the midterm elections in a couple of years. There are others who start to say, well, will we have midterm elections? Could we really be going in a much more authoritarian direction?
This podcast has been made possible by the Winston Churchill Trust Australia. I'm Bryce Corbett. Thanks for listening to episode 1 of The Big Threat.